Point at something. Just lift your arm and point at a spot on the floor. If there is a dog in the room, it will almost certainly look where you pointed. It will not look at your finger. It will not stare at you blankly. It will track the invisible line running from your hand out into space and check what is at the end of it. And it will do this without ever having been trained to, sometimes as a puppy only a few weeks old. That sounds trivial. It is one of the strangest things any animal does. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, sharing the overwhelming majority of our DNA, are bad at this. Raise a chimp around humans, point at a container with food in it, and it will struggle. Wolves, the actual ancestors of dogs, hand-raised by humans from birth and socialized as thoroughly as possible, are also noticeably worse at it than an ordinary puppy that has spent barely any time around people at all. An animal that we consider so unremarkable that it sleeps under the dinner table is outperforming our nearest evolutionary relatives at reading us. Let's dig into this properly, because the explanation involves a shared history far longer and far weirder than most people realize. Start with the timeline, and start with the caveat, because this is one of those areas where confident answers are usually overstated. Dogs descend from wolves. That much is settled by genetics beyond reasonable dispute. Nearly everything after that is actively argued about. Estimates for when domestication began range from roughly 15,000 years ago to well over 30,000, depending on which evidence you weight. Archaeological remains, mitochondrial DNA, nuclear genome comparisons, or mutation rate assumption, all of which give somewhat different answers. The location is equally contested. Various studies have placed the origin in Europe, in Siberia, in Central Asia, in East Asia, and in the Middle East. Some analyses have proposed that domestication happened more than once, in separate places, with those populations later mixing. Others argue for a single origin with subsequent spread. The debate is ongoing and has not resolved. There is a further complication. The wolves that became dogs are not modern wolves. They were a population of ancient wolves that has since gone extinct, meaning the gray wolf you see today is more like a cousin than an ancestor. Comparisons between dogs and modern wolves are therefore informative, but not a clean before and after. What is much less controversial is the range. Whether it was 15,000 years or 40,000, dogs were with us before agriculture, before permanent settlements, before pottery, before metal, before writing. Every other domestic animal, sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, horses, chickens, came later, and came after we had settled down and started farming. Dogs joined us while we were still mobile hunter-gatherers, which means the relationship predates civilization entirely. That length of shared time is the foundation for everything else, but it does not by itself explain the pointing. Let's talk about how it likely started too, because this represents a shift in thinking that overturned the traditional story. The old narrative was that humans took wolf pups, raised them, tamed them, and bred the tamest, deliberate, human-driven, top-down. It makes a satisfying story, and it is probably wrong, or at least incomplete. The alternative, now widely favored, is self-domestication. Human camps produce waste, bones, scraps, offal, anything not worth eating. That waste is a reliable, concentrated food source requiring no hunting. Any wolf willing to approach a human camp gets a substantial caloric advantage over one that stays away. The barrier is fear. Wolves that panic at the sight of a person cannot exploit the resource. Wolves with a slightly higher tolerance for human proximity can. Those bolder animals eat better, survive better, and raise more pups, and their pups inherit the temperament. Across generations, a population emerges that lives near humans by preference, and the process is driven mostly by wolf behavior rather than human intention. People were selecting for tameness by simply existing and producing garbage. The most striking support for this idea comes from an experiment that started in Soviet Siberia in the late 1950s. Researchers took silver foxes from a fur farm and selected them on a single criterion: willingness to approach a human. Hand. Nothing about appearance, nothing about anatomy, only that one behavioral trait, generation after generation. Within a few dozen generations, they had foxes that behaved like dogs, seeking human contact, wagging their tails, whining for attention. But they also got things nobody had selected for: floppy ears, curled tails, patches of white fur, shorter snouts. Changes in the timing of development so that adult foxes retained juvenile behaviors, altered stress hormone levels, and shifted reproductive cycles. That cluster is now called domestication syndrome, and versions of it appear across many domesticated species. One prominent explanation involves neural crest cells, a population of embryonic cells that migrate through the developing body and contribute to pigmentation, cartilage, parts of the skull, and the adrenal glands. Selecting for reduced fear may select for slightly reduced neural crest cell activity, and everything else follows as a side effect. That explanation has been influential and has also drawn serious criticism, with some researchers arguing the syndrome is less consistent across species species than the theory requires. It remains a live scientific debate rather than a settled account. The fox experiment has also faced scrutiny of its own. Critics have noted that the founding population came from fur farms, where animals had already been bred in captivity for decades, meaning some selection for tameness may have preceded the experiment. The core result is still widely regarded as important, with appropriate caution about how cleanly it maps onto wild wolves. One more thing about the self-domestication picture is worth noting, because the modern pet dog is a misleading reference point. Most dogs on Earth are not pets. Estimates vary, but a large majority of the global dog population consists of free-ranging village dogs, street dogs, and scavengers living loosely around human settlements without owners, feeding largely on waste. That is much closer to what dogs were for most of their existence, and it looks remarkably like the scenario the self-domestication model describes: animals making a living at the edge of human activity, tolerated rather than kept. Selective breeding into distinct breeds, by contrast, is astonishingly recent. The overwhelming majority of recognized breeds were developed within the last couple of centuries, mostly during a burst of enthusiasm for standardized types in 19th century Europe. The wild variation in size and shape across modern dogs, from something you can hold in one hand to something that can knock you over, is a very thin layer of very recent history sitting on top of tens of thousands of years of a much more uniform animal. Now, back to the pointing, because this is where dogs become properly remarkable. This detail is worth sitting with directly. Following a human point requires understanding that another creature's gesture is about something. The finger is meaningless in itself. To use it, the dog has to grasp that the human has information, that the human intends to communicate that information, and that the gesture refers to a location in shared space. Researchers found that dogs do this readily. Puppies do it before extensive human contact, which suggests it is largely inherited rather than individually learned. Dogs also follow gaze direction, respond to head nods toward a target, and can even use more abstract markers where a person places an object near the correct container. Hand-raised wolves, given the same tests under comparable conditions, generally perform worse. They can learn it with substantial training, but it does not come naturally in the way it does for dogs. This is the key comparison, because it isolates the effect of domestication from the effect of individual exposure to humans. Breed makes a difference here as well, and it makes it in a direction that fits the overall story. Dogs bred for close cooperative work with people, herding breeds, gun dogs, retrievers, tend to perform better on tasks involving human gestures and eye contact than breeds developed to work independently, such as certain hounds and livestock guardians whose job description involved operating far from any handler for long stretches. The variation within the species tracks the amount of human coordination each type was built around, which is close to what you would predict if this whole capacity is a product of selection for working alongside us. Some researchers have pushed back, arguing that wolf performance improves considerably with the right rearing and testing conditions, and that early studies may have understated wolf ability. The gap appears real, but its size is debated. Dogs are also unusually attentive to whether a human is paying attention. Tell a dog not to take food, then leave the room or close your eyes, and dogs are substantially more likely to take it than when you are watching. They track whether your eyes are open, whether you are facing them, whether your view is blocked. That is a sensitivity to attentional state, which is a component of what psychologists call theory of mind, the ability to model what another mind knows. Whether dogs have theory of mind in any full sense is disputed, and probably not in the way humans do. What seems better supported is that dogs are exceptionally good at reading behavioral cues that correlate with attention without necessarily having an abstract concept of another creature's mental states. The distinction is subtle, and researchers disagree about where exactly dogs fall on that spectrum. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's talk about the eyes too, because this represents perhaps the single most surprising piece of the puzzle. Sustained eye contact between animals is usually a threat. Stare at a wolf, a chimp, or most mammals, and you are issuing a challenge. Dogs broke that rule completely. A Japanese research team examined what happens when dogs and their owners look at each other. They measured oxytocin, a hormone involved in social bonding, released in humans during parent-infant interaction, in both species before and after periods of interaction. They found that longer mutual gaze gazing was associated with rising oxytocin in both the dog and the person. The dog looks at you, your oxytocin rises, you interact more warmly, the dog's oxytocin rises, the dog looks at you more. A self-reinforcing loop. When the researchers administered oxytocin to dogs, female dogs increased gazing at their owners, and the owner's oxytocin rose in turn. Hand-raised wolves in comparable conditions did not show the same gazing behavior. The proposed interpretation is that dogs hijacked a bonding mechanism that evolved for parents and infants and turned it on a completely different species. The neurochemistry that makes a human parent attached to a baby is being triggered, at least partially, by an animal. It gets more pointed than that. Researchers comparing the facial anatomy of dogs and wolves identified a small muscle above the eye, one that raises the inner eyebrow, producing the expression most people describe as puppy dog eyes. In dogs, this muscle is well developed and consistently present. In wolves, it is minimal or absent, with the reported exception of one husky, a breed genetically close to wolves. The expression it produces makes the eyes look larger and the face more infant-like, and it resembles a human expression associated with sadness. Follow-up work found that shelter dogs producing this expression more frequently were rehomed faster. The implication is fairly stark. Over thousands of years, human preference appears to have sculpted an actual anatomical structure in another species whose only function is to make us feel something. Dogs did not evolve that muscle to see better or eat better. They evolved it because it works on us. Let's talk about language too, because this represents another area where dogs quietly outperform expectations. Some dogs learn a lot of words. A border collie studied over years reportedly learned the names of over 1,000 objects and could retrieve them by name. Another dog demonstrated something resembling inference. Presented with a group of familiar toys plus one unfamiliar one and asked for a name it had never heard. It selected the new object, apparently reasoning that the unknown name must belong to the unknown thing. That process, called fast mapping, is one of the mechanisms by which human children acquire vocabulary rapidly. Brain imaging work has added another layer. Researchers in Hungary trained dogs to lie still and awake in a scanner while hearing recorded speech. The results suggested dogs process the meaning of familiar words and the emotional tone of speech in different regions, with a hemispheric division broadly similar to the human pattern, and that reward-related areas responded most strongly when a praise word was delivered in a praising tone. Both channels seem to matter the word and the way it is said. That said, the claim that dogs understand language should be kept in proportion. Most dogs know a modest handful of words. Exceptional individuals are exceptional, and there is no evidence of grammar or syntax. What dogs excel at is associating sounds with outcomes and reading tone with great precision. Let's talk about barking too, because this represents one of the clearest signs that dogs are built for us specifically. Adult wolves bark very little. It happens, but it is a minor part of their vocal repertoire, usually short and used in limited contexts. Wolves communicate primarily through howls, whines, growls, and body posture. Dogs bark constantly in an enormous range of contexts, with variations in pitch, length, and rhythm that differ depending on whether the dog is alarmed, playing, frustrated, or greeting someone. That difference is not accidental. One widely discussed explanation is that barking was selected for during domestication because it works as an alerting signal for humans, a sound that carries, gets attention, and demands a response. Another line of thinking treats it partly as a byproduct of the developmental changes that come with domestication. Since barking is more common in juvenile wolves and domesticated animals frequently retain juvenile traits into adulthood, both may be operating at once. What is measurable is the effect on the other end. Studies playing recorded barks to human listeners have found that people with no particular dog expertise can often identify the context of a bark at rates well above chance, separating an alarm bark from a play bark from a lonely one. That is a remarkable thing for cross-species communication. A sound produced by one species is reliably parsed for emotional content by another, without training on either side. Dogs also appear to modulate their vocalizations depending on the audience. They bark differently at people than at other dogs, and many owners report their dog producing sounds it uses on humans and essentially never on its own kind. Whining directed at a person in particular functions much like an infant's cry, hard to ignore, escalating if unanswered, and effective at producing action. Let's talk about smell too, because this represents a channel of understanding humans barely think about. about. A dog's olfactory ability is on a completely different scale from ours, with vastly more receptor cells and a far larger share of brain tissue devoted to processing scent. That means dogs are receiving continuous chemical information about us that we have no access to at all. Fear, stress, and exertion change what a human body emits. Trained dogs have been used to detect a range of medical conditions by scent, and some dogs alert reliably to seizures or blood sugar changes in their owners before any visible symptom appears. Detection performance varies considerably by condition and study, and results in controlled settings have sometimes been weaker than early reports suggested. This is an area where enthusiasm has occasionally outrun the evidence. Still, the basic point stands. When a dog seems to know you are upset before you have said anything, part of what is happening is that you have already told it, chemically, and had no idea you were speaking. Let's talk about the limits too, because this represents the part that gets left out of most versions of this story, and leaving it out produces a badly distorted picture. Dogs read us extraordinarily well within a narrow band, and misread us badly outside it. They are excellent at detecting attention, emotional tone, movement, and immediate intention. They are poor at anything requiring an understanding of time, causality, across long intervals, or abstract rules. This is where a great deal of everyday misunderstanding between people and dogs comes from. The classic example is coming home to damage and finding the dog crouching, ears back, avoiding eye contact, an expression people routinely interpret as guilt. Experimental work suggests that this appearance depends much more on the owner's behavior than on what the dog actually did. Dogs shown scolding produce the expression whether or not they were responsible, and dogs who did misbehave but whose owners stay calm often show nothing. What is being displayed looks a great deal like appeasement in response to an angry human, rather than an admission about an event hours in the past. Similarly, dogs appear to respond strongly to human distress, approaching, nuzzling, pushing at a crying person. Whether that constitutes empathy in any rich sense is contested. Some researchers describe it as emotional contagion, an automatic transfer of arousal that does not require understanding the other's situation. Others argue there is evidence of something more directed, pointing to studies where dogs worked harder to reach a person who was crying than one who was humming. The honest position is that the behavior is well documented, and its underlying mechanism is not settled. And dogs have almost no grasp of consequences separated from actions by more than a few seconds. Punishment delivered after the fact teaches fear of the person rather than an association with the behavior, because the dog's model of the world simply does not connect those two events. A great many training problems trace back to humans assuming their dog understands more about cause and effect than it possibly could. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together. Dogs understand humans well because understanding humans has been their primary survival strategy for longer than we have had agriculture. Every ancestor of every dog alive today succeeded by being good at people. Reading intention, tracking attention, responding to tone, producing expressions that generated care, those were the skills that got fed and got protected and got to reproduce. That created a lopsided kind of expertise. Dogs are not generally smarter than wolves. On several measures of independent problem solving, wolves outperform them. Show a wolf and a dog a puzzle box with food inside and the wolf tends to keep working at it, while the dog frequently stops and looks back at the nearest human. That looking back is the whole thing. Rather than a failure of intelligence, actually it reflects a completely different strategy for solving problems. The wolf's approach is to solve it alone. The dog's approach is to recruit a human, and across thousands of years that has been the more effective option by a wide margin. Meanwhile, the influence ran both directions. Humans with dogs hunted better, detected threats earlier, and had help managing animals. Some researchers have argued the partnership meaningfully shaped human development, though claims about how much are speculative and should be treated as such, which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. We usually describe domestication as something humans did to animals, but the animal that understands us best is one that spent 30,000 years studying us, and got so good at it that we grew a species of creature whose eyebrows evolved specifically to move us.